Welcome to the Microsoft IT Pro Podcast, a show about Office 365, Azure, and the IT Pro and end user side of life. Each week, we'll discuss a different topic or recent news related to Office 365 and Azure and how it relates to you as an IT Pro. The MS IT Pro Podcast is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. All right, so here we are, Scott, another episode. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. I have a nice big cup of coffee, and I'm super excited to talk about a bunch of acronyms.
Yes, acronyms are great, and I know this is one of your recent favorite acronyms.
One of several. I mean, there's just so many to choose from. You want to tell everybody what we're going to talk about today?
Sure. So today we're going to talk about MAM, not yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, but the Microsoft's Mobile Application Management, MAM. So we'll dive into this topic, look at what it is, how it compares to some other services, and hopefully you guys will come away educated on MAM and what to do and what not to do.
Yeah, it's really one of those interesting things because as consumers of Office 365, we are given access to a couple of different things sometimes, depending on the SKU you're in. And particularly if you're in those E SKUs, E3s, E5s, you tend to get things like MDM, so mobile device management, not to be confused with mobile application management, or MAM.
Exactly. We really should do an episode on the SKUs before we get too far into these.
Licensing will be a fun one. Yeah, absolutely. We definitely should. We can talk about SKU packs and entitlements and, shopping carts and all that fun stuff.
Exactly. But anyways, back to the topic for today. Back to MAM.
Back to MAM. Yeah, so MAM is really interesting. So like I mentioned, if you are one of those kind of more premium subscribers, over time, you will pick up access to additional features that you might not have known about. So if you happen to do EMS, Enterprise Mobility Suite, or maybe you've gone ahead and subscribed to some additional functionality within Azure AD, because, hey, every Office 365 subscriber is also an Azure subscriber because that's where our identity is backed. So if you've gone ahead and stepped up a little bit and gotten into some of the Azure AD premium SKUs, you will start to gain access to additional functionality. And one of those pieces of functionality that you will gain access to is Intune. Intune is typically centered around that device management side of things. So whether that is patching a Windows device or ensuring compliance on a Mac, or even registering a mobile device. But one of the biggest things that happens with device management is you have to go through an enrollment process. So, inherently, we're talking about managing the entire device. And sometimes that's not the place you want to be. If you're in a bring your own device scenario, a BYOD, or maybe you just don't want the operational overhead of maintaining things like, Apple developer certificates so that you can register iOS devices in Intune, things like that. There is another option for you. So you can step into what is called Intune Mobile Application Management. And there's a version of that's called Mobile Application Management without enrollment. So that would be MAMWE, just to keep throwing acronyms out there. But what that lets you do is you get yourself out of the mindset of saying, Ben, it's great. We work together. Maybe we work for the same company, and you're going to register your device. And when you go away, even though that was your personal device, as your employer, the person that you registered with, I'm going to have some rights to go ahead and wipe your device. That doesn't give you the warm fuzzies as a person that perhaps somebody else has access to more data on your device, or even the ability to initiate something like a remote wipe. And from the management side, on my side, that's a big responsibility, right? But it's a lot easier to step in and say, Ben, you tie into our Exchange Online environment, and we're chatting through Skype, and maybe you use something like Yammer and SharePoint. So you've got all these mobile apps on your device. and you're happily running along and using them. What if we flip it around a little bit and I say I want to manage not your device, but the application itself. And more specifically, I want to ensure there are operational controls in place to manage the data within those applications. So let me go ahead and be able to do something like when you are inside of Outlook, if you copy something, so you go into iOS or Android, Windows 10 mobile, whatever it happens to be, if you copy some text, I want to make sure that you can't paste that text into another application that is not either A, a Microsoft application, or B, managed application, right? So it's great that you can copy and paste some text out of Outlook and go ahead and paste it into a Word document, but I don't necessarily want that going to Apple Notes and then maybe syncing back through IMAP or iCloud or something else over to another service. So we start to pick up a bunch of operational controls.
I know the whole data management is one of my favorite parts, especially when you look at what Microsoft is doing with some of these apps. I think of OneDrive specifically, where OneDrive, you no longer have a OneDrive for business and a OneDrive for your personal data. You just have OneDrive and you add both accounts to them. So like you said, with the MDM, I don't necessarily want my employer or whoever I'm working for controlling my entire device, including all that personal OneDrive stuff. The ability to let them just control the OneDrive for business data and just to wipe the OneDrive for business data within that OneDrive app is really appealing to me as an end user.
Yeah, it certainly it eases that sell when you go to users and say, we're going to be doing something with your device, whether it's actually their device, right? Like they've walked in the door, they've paid for it and it's theirs, or they kind of perceive it to be theirs. Maybe they've been an employee for a long time and they just don't understand policies and procedures and things like that. And one of the nice things you can do is you can kind of backdoor, kind of grow into these policies over time. So effectively what happens is you will create some Intune application management policies. So you do all this through the Azure portal today. So through the new portal, portal.azure.com. And you'll go ahead and you'll create a policy per mobile operating system that you want to manage, or per OS. So I will have a policy for iOS devices, and I'll have a policy for Android devices. And if you deploy Windows 10 mobile in your org, you'll have a policy maybe for those as well. Once you have a policy, you can optionally assign that policy to Azure AD security groups. So you can do things like, say you DIR-sync more folks up to Azure AD than are Office 365 subscribers, right? Maybe you do something else with those identities. So what you can do is, because you're this Azure AD premium subscriber, you can create a dynamic security group. So based on some attributes on the users, like I could create a group that's all my Office 365 subscribers. If I had an attribute I could filter on to get there. And I could dynamically manage that group, and I could dynamically bring individuals in and out to have these policies applied to them. So I've created a policy. Let's walk down. We'll say iOS. I've given it a security group. I've assigned it to that security principal. So I've said anybody who's in this group who opens one of these applications that's affected by this policy is going to be subject to rules X, Y, and Z. So the next thing I need to do is figure out which applications I want to manage. So this is a little bit interesting when you start to get into it. So if you think about the way applications are developed for mobile devices and who owns them at Microsoft, there is a different product group that owns Excel mobile versus Outlook or the old Acompli app. So they all tend to adopt the Intune SDKs at different times. So what you'll find is typically there's better application coverage, aka more applications that you can protect on the iOS policies than there are on Android. Android just seems to be a little bit further behind. I think there's 14 or 15 Microsoft applications that you can protect today on the iOS side, and it's like 10 or 11 on Android. And that tends to ebb and flow, right? So as new things are onboarded, so a couple months ago, Power BI was added to that mix. So, you can go in and you can do MAM with Power BI. Teams was a new SKU that was recently added. Even back when that was in preview, they actually released the ability to come through and go ahead and manage those mobile applications. So, we've picked a policy. We've picked the users it's going to apply to. We've picked the applications it's going to apply to. And then the last thing we need to do is actually go ahead and configure a policy, right? So you're going to go ahead and you're going to, policies for MAM without enrollment are pretty basic. I'm going to try and do a couple things. I'm going to say I don't want to be on a jailbroken or rooted device, probably. I think usually that's something you're going to check by default, pretty standard. But one of the really cool things you can do is you can set things like a PIN. So typically with Intune, you would enroll your device and you'd say, this PIN is going to apply to the whole device. So anytime they unlock it, they're going to need a PIN. But because now I'm managing at the application level, each application is going to have a PIN associated with it, and every user is going to have to pin into just that app. So day to day, when a user is working on their phone, if they choose not to protect it with Touch ID or passcode, horrible idea. They should totally do that. But if they choose not to, you can still make sure that your applications and your data are covered. And, there's a bunch of other really cool little settings that you can get into with these as well. So like on iOS and Android, this is applicable as well. You can say, don't allow anything to take a screenshot of this application. So maybe we've said you can't copy and paste data in and out from other applications that aren't managed. So maybe somebody tries to be sneaky and take a screenshot of that application. What it'll just come through is as a big obfuscated blur. And you'll even see that when you go into app switchers and things like that. It's a really, really quick, easy, turnkey solution, something you can whip up, turn on, and it kind of just works, which is really nice.
Yeah, I know. I've gone through and set this up for some tenants, and just the ease of implementing this, creating those policies, assigning them, getting them to work is so much easier than when I tried to do something similar, at least with Intune and the mobile device management. And they really do have a lot of policies, even though you're not managing the entire device. You can still do things like prevent users from backing up that data in those managed apps to iTunes or iCloud. Like you said, prevent some of the save as, set stuff so that any app data is actually encrypted when that device is locked. Even contact sync, disabling contact sync. So those contacts that maybe in Outlook aren't syncing out to some of those native apps on iOS or Android that aren't being managed by these mobile application management policies.
Yeah, it's I can't stress how easy it is to turn on as long as you've got the licensing available for it. It is literally a next kind of experience. It can be a little bit weird on that. It's so easy as an admin for you to deploy. But you'll have to spend some time with your users, educating them on what happens. So when I'm a user and that policy is applied to me brand new, right off the cuff, I'm going to get a message that pops up and it says, the data in this application is protected by your company. So you need to click OK so that it can be closed, and then you need to reopen it. And you go, what was that? So you'll have to kind of warn them those things were coming. And you'll also have to be careful and kind of educate users. Not so much maybe your singular employees, but if you work with contractors and things like that who have access to your data, these application policies can be a little bit weird if you're doing two work accounts in the same app, and both work accounts are covered by differing application policies. So in that case, you have company A and company B. Company A kind of wins because it was the first one that signed into. Or if you want company Y to apply, you've got to sign out to company A, sign out of company B, and then go ahead and sign back in with company B. So you might have some weird kind of education things or some edge cases to pick up there over time.
Yeah, definitely all things to be aware of. Another thing, so once you've implemented this, once it's applied, once users are using it, it's being applied to some of their apps, there's also some monitoring, it looks like, that we have as part of this application management to actually see what's going on. What apps are protected, what apps are unprotected.
Yeah, so you will see not only which applications you protected, because that's kind of important, right? That's part of your policy. But you can also start to do things like track user metrics. So you will see on a holistic level at the policy level. So I have that iOS policy, and maybe I've assigned it to a security group that has 1,000 users in it. I will get to see how many of those 1,000 have actually ever signed into any of those apps. And start to get some usage metrics out of there. So you can not only kind of treat it as like a monitoring on the admin side, but you could also correlate it back to maybe you're doing like an adoption campaign about a rollout for Outlook on iOS, right? You want to encourage people to go down that route and use that. You'd actually be able to track user sign-ins and things through that application policy if it was applicable to those users.
Very cool. So another topic that ties into MAM is this whole conditional access to data as well, specifically SharePoint data, OneDrive data. What's some of this conditional access stuff all about?
So conditional access is a little bit different. So now you're going to step away from managing specific mobile applications, and you're going to talk about access policies for particular products or kind of SKUs or entitlements, things that you consume within the Office 365 product stack, right? So really you can think about it as kind of a little bit more of a device-centric thing. And a device could be a mobile device or it could be a PC, Windows or Mac, right? It's just a device that's accessing data. So again, this is going to require some more kind of premium licensing, Azure AD Premium, EMS, things like that. But what you can do is you can create device compliance policies. So, that's back to, is this thing jailbroken? Is it rooted? If it's a Windows device, maybe I want to make sure that only domain joined devices can go ahead and pull data out of my environments. Things like that, right? Pretty straightforward once you start to wrap your head around it. So you're going to pick the part of the stack that you want to protect. So maybe I want to do, let's say Exchange Online, right? Email is a pretty good one. So I already know, I've done my Office 2016 deployment on mobile devices. I've encouraged my users to go down and do things like Outlook for iOS or things like that are going to support ADAL and kind of modern authentication. So once I've got kind of all the prerequisites out of the way, I'm going to pick the platforms I support, whether that's all or I'm going to target specific ones. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same kind of thing. I'm going to walk down that path of configuring a policy. It might be a little bit different in this case. So conditional access might be, I only want users who are in a specific IP range to be able to access these services. So in that way, I could ensure that people could only connect to my Exchange data when they're on my network or they're VPN'd in, right? Take away some of those kind of like internet edge kind of things that you run into. It's a little bit different once you get into some of the other products. So SharePoint is different than Exchange, is different than the next thing. And of course, these conditional access policies are not to be confused with, because those are part of Intune, are not to be confused with the conditional access, limited access policies which they announced for SharePoint back in early March 2017, that are in public preview right now, because those are a little bit different too. Those are configured just straight through Azure AD. And, kind of all over the place and horribly named. I don't know why they named something for SharePoint limited access when, you tend to see limited access and permissions in SharePoint all the time. But that's neither here nor there.
Well, Microsoft is named for their impeccable ability to come up with the best names for all their products, right?
Oh, absolutely. It would really help if the product groups talk to each other sometimes, but who knows how that's going to go.
How many times have they used the name Surface for different devices now?
Yeah. Hubs, TVs, devices, yeah. A lot of things.
Yeah. You forgot the whole coffee table one.
Yeah. Well, those were the original Surfaces, right? And then you had we'll go on a big tangent. That was all that perceptive pixel stuff. Yeah, they had some cool things. But these limited access ones, they go, because they're managed just in Azure AD, they're a little bit easier to surface up. And you can kind of leverage your existing stuff that's out there. I'm not too sure about licensing on that one. I don't know if you are, if it requires EMS or anything like that. I think it does because it still leverages Intune in the background in some form or fashion.
I believe that one still leverages, I think Azure AD Premium is what you need for that, which again is part of the EMS, or you can just go buy Azure AD Premium on its own.
Gotcha. Yeah. So these are a little bit different. We talked about MAM, not being able to copy and paste data. So something I can do with like a SharePoint policy, being conditional access like that, I can come in, I can say, I only want to allow on the SharePoint side, like I want to enforce a rule that says for any files that can be viewed on the web, so think like Office Online, right? I go into my OneDrive and I click a Word document or an Excel file or things like that. I want to block downloading. So now all of a sudden I'm in a situation where without having to configure an IRM policy or anything with Azure RMS or anything like that, I've just got a blanket policy that applies to these users, these groups, that kind of thing, conditionally. So as long as they meet the conditions, here's the things that are going to happen, and I can go ahead and just block downloads. So maybe you want to block downloads for external users no matter what, because that's your security policy. So now you can totally go ahead and make that happen. So I can say, even though we allow external guest access, I want to make sure that people who are only on domain joined machines can download these files. For everybody else, it's blocked. And I think that's super powerful, right? If you sit down and start to think through some of the scenarios and or operational controls that your organizations might want to put in place.
Yeah, definitely. It's really nice to see Microsoft continuing to improve around this. I know, especially with Office 365 now, when it's connected to the internet, you can get to it from anywhere, from any home computer, mobile device, coffee shop, or at work. It's good to see Microsoft continuing to roll out some of these features to help you better manage that data, especially because you lose some of that traditional management you had when you had SharePoint Exchange, all of those sitting on-prem, and you could actually say, well, a user has to connect to VPN or has to actually be on our physical network to access the data. All these improvements are really, I think, helping to relieve some of the concerns users had about moving their data up into the cloud.
Yeah, I'm a little ambivalent on that one, right? So typically, the organizations are going to be the ones who make those decisions, whether it's your IT department in combination with your legal and HR and all those kinds of things to make sure you're compliant. Users tend to follow along. or go where you're going to make them put their data, right? So if you're an organization that said, hey, it's great, we're ready to onboard into OneDrive for Business in Office 365. So you go ahead, pick up your licensing, things like that. Users might say, hey, I'm not comfortable storing my data in the cloud, but you can spend some time educating them, but then at the end of the day, that's a business decision that's been made, right? That we're going to go that way and we're going to do these things. So at some point, your users kind of just get on the train, or else it leaves the station without them. So one of the other things that comes into play here. You mentioned like monitoring. We talked a little bit about configuration. I should throw out that all that configuration kind of stuff today, it's done through the various portals. So it'll be done through things like the Azure portal, or maybe through the Office 365 admin portal, things like that. It is very much a click, next kind of experience. Not so much managed with PowerShell and things like that. There might be portions that you can automate. So maybe managing your security groups and things like that in Azure AD. But the policies themselves and things tend to be just done through the portal sides. And one other thing we didn't kind of touch on, which I think is important over time, and we should probably do a deeper dive on it, is some kind of compliance things that come into play. So whether that be where your data is stored, how it's recovered, things like that. The product stack's been growing over time. We recently had things like recoverability for Office 365 groups, or those unified groups or Outlook groups, whatever we want to call them today. Really that membership construct and the stuff that backs it. That was just introduced recently. So you've got some a bunch of other options to take a look at when you're looking at your environment and deciding where data goes, how the data is accessed, who's going to access it, and really what they're going to do once they have access to it.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to do an episode on compliance. One other thing I also wanted to mention too was the whole app installation process. I know with mobile device management, a lot of times you're actually bundling the apps. They're installing them from Intune, from whatever MDM software you may be using to install the apps. The other nice thing I really like about MAM is that you no longer have to bundle those apps. Users just go out to the App Store, whether it's Android, iOS, Windows Phone, for those 2 users out there that are still on Windows Phone. And you just install the apps from the native App Store. MAM picks them up and starts applying the policies. So there's no more you having to go out and actually wrap those apps and package them up for your users to install.
Yeah, if you think purely about the end user side of it, MAM is far less intrusive and way easier to onboard into. So when you go with MDM, what you've got to go through before you can even start talking about managing the device is enrolling the device, right? So that means typically with Intune that my users are going to have to download an app called the company portal. They're going to have to sign into the company portal. They're going to have to download some certificates for device management, whether they're iOS or Android, Windows 10 mobile devices as well. So it's a heavier process. They're going to get a dialogue that pops up and says, your company, blah, 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 wants to install this certificate. Do you trust it? Yes or no? And they have to say yes, but they don't always realize the impacts of what all those things kind of are. Versus, like you mentioned, rather than having to go download this company app, just go download Word. Well, what do I do with it once I download? Just go ahead and sign in with your user ID and password like you would to any of our other applications. It's going to let you in, it's going to activate you, and you're just going to get back to doing what you need to do, right? As an end user, as a business user, really you just need to be able to consume the services. It doesn't necessarily matter how hard or easy we made it for you to get in there.
Yeah. All right. Well, that about wraps us up. Again, want to keep this under 30 minutes. So any last comments, thoughts, or go ahead and wrap up for the day?
I think the only thing I would say is if you do have this licensing available to you within your organization and you haven't looked at it yet, highly encourage you to kind of go down that path, do a POC, anything like that. If you have access to fast track deployment services or things like that. They can be a big help as well. But it is super, super easy to onboard in. It's really cool functionality. And if you're paying for it, you really do want to make sure that you're using it and getting the most out of it.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. If you enjoyed the podcast, go leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It helps to get the word out so more IT pros can learn about Office 365 and Azure. If you have any questions you want us to address on the show or feedback about the show, feel free to reach out via our website, Twitter, or Facebook. Thanks again for listening and have a great day.